Again, welcome to this week's office hour for ESG and ESG-CV. My name is Marian Goldburn, and I am today's moderator. If you're just joining us, please go to the chat and introduce yourself with your name and the region you represent. As a reminder, this office hours session is being recorded for public record. Office hours recordings will be available on the HCD ESG webpage under Technical Assistance and Training. If you don't see them posted yet, just know that HCD is working on getting them uploaded to the website. A copy of the slide deck and recording will be emailed to you by your grant administrator. Next slide, please. If you have questions, please use this format. All questions must be submitted in the chat box. Please type your organization and question in the chat box. The team will read the questions out loud at the end of the presentation and will provide answers, if possible, throughout the presentation. Because today's topic has a lot of content, any questions related to indirect costs will be answered via email when we send out the Q&A transcript. All questions and answers entered in the chat box will be recorded as part of the public record, and we will be emailing out a full transcript of the Q&A. Next slide, please. So today's session agenda will include the following. We will have some announcements. We will have ESG and ESG-CV updates, ESG and ESG-CV Q&A, and our brown bag session on indirect costs. Next slide, please. Alongside our presenters, we also have several HCD staff, including ESG representatives, ESG-CV grant administrators, and other consultants who are able to answer questions during the Q&A sessions. We have some new HCD training series. California HCD announces a new and non-traditional providers training series that will provide foundational knowledge about ESG and ESG-CV to new and non-traditional providers. New and non-traditional includes providers that are new to ESG or ESG-CV funding, or not traditionally involved with ESG or ESG-CV funding. For example, providers who are focused on racial equality, tribal nations, or any other providers that wish to expand their ESG or ESG-CV knowledge and skills. Each month, trainers will focus on a single ESG and ESG core topic. Topics will begin with large group presentations, continue with smaller opt-in learning sessions, and finish with one-on-one training and technical assistance as requested. The first session begins on February 22nd, and you can register for the series by clicking on the link in this presentation, or it will also be put in the chat. Next slide, please. We have a new HCD form for reimbursement process that we would like to tell you about. When sub-recipients receive their reimbursement requests, and this is also called RFF for ESG-CV and DIR for ESG annual, there may be corrections or changes that needs to be made. So the following guidance applies to both ESG and ESG-CV subrecipients. The standard Form 209's purpose is to provide official documentation that the RFF or DIR needs to be corrected. When a change is required, the HCD representative will be filling out and sending a standard Form 209. The form will be sent in eCivis if the reimbursement was submitted in eCivis, or the form will be emailed if the reimbursement was submitted via email for review. In order to avoid triggering the Form 209, subrecipients should do their best to ensure that the RFF or DIR is completed properly. Things to always double check for include the approved current budget as it is listed in eCivis. The reimbursement dollar requests in eCivis should match the RFF or DIR forms. The billing dates needs to be correct, and the proper backup documentation should be submitted. To review the previous ESG RFF webinar, you can click at the link that's provided here. Next slide, please. So I will now turn it over to Connie for our ESG updates.
All right, thank you. Good morning, everybody. So 2021 ESG applications, we have finished our review just a few days ago, and we anticipate we'll be able to make award announcements to those that will receive funding. The end of this month, we'll be taking the recommended awards to our internal loan committee. And we're done with the review. We've come up with our award list. So within a couple of weeks, we'll be able to make award announcements. For those that have 2020 ESG annual contracts, this is just a reminder. We are now really focusing on paying attention to what are on the detailed expense reports, or the DERs. Please be as detailed and itemized as much as possible. What we're seeing oftentimes, for example, we'll see staff charges. Sue Smith, $2,000. We have no idea what Sue Smith does. We don't know what her title is. Please itemize that out. And we don't even need to see the employee's name. But if you give us their title, that will help us out a lot. If you're lumping together a bunch of charges and on one line on the DER, we would ask that you, as much as possible, and we know it's more data entry, itemize, start thinking about itemizing more on your DER. Again, this ties into this mini monitoring that we started a few months ago. Your reps are going to turn around and ask you for some backup documentation. So if you want $30,000 worth of charges, that includes a lot of multiple things within one line, you're going to be asked to provide backups for all that. So if you have any questions, please reach out to us. Please reach out to your rep. But start thinking about itemizing out on your detailed expense report. Next slide, please. Just as a reminder for those who have 2020 contracts, the expenditure deadline, yes, July 7th of this year. It's not too far down the road. Be thinking about, make sure you're spending your money. We don't want to disencumber funds. We never want to do that. So please, please make sure you're spending your annual contracts. If you're struggling, if you need some help, please give us a call. Please reach out to your rep, and we'll meet with you on Teams, and we'll try to think through some stuff. So don't wait till the last minute. Next slide, please. And this is just a reminder who your ESG annual team is. We have a great team. We are fully staffed. We're working really hard to provide good customer service to you, because we truly do believe you are our partners and we're in this together. So when we're asking for monitoring backup, again, that mini monitoring, or you choose a couple expenses off of every RFF you give us. Well, let's work together as far as to try to come up with the types of forms we're asking for. And we will eventually get you some documentation, kind of a checklist that will help you know what we'll be asking for. And that is all I have today. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Connie. And now I have just a few ESG updates and reminders. All ESG-CV subrecipients that provide their contact information should have received an email from HCD with a link to access the monitoring site. Please check your email spam folder if you did not receive the link. If it is not in your spam folder, please contact your grant administrator if your contact person did not receive an email with the link to access that site. Next slide, please. So we have some upcoming office hour topics. On February 16th, we will be presenting on the California HCD ESG-CV monitoring. On February 23rd, we'll present on housing first principles. And on March 2nd, we'll present on trauma-informed practices. Next slide, please. So this next slide has some COVID response resources, including standing up infection control measures, resources from the CDC and NHCHC guidance. Please, next slide. And this slide has some ESG resource links, including the ESG regulations, ESG-CV notices, and also some TA resources. Next slide, please. Okay, so we are finished with this part of our presentation. If there are any questions, please go ahead and put those in the chat and we can get a response today. And if not, then we will follow up when we send out the information. Next slide, please. And this is how you can contact us. If you have further questions for annual ESG-CV, please reach out to your ESG rep, or you can send an email to esg@hcd.ca.gov. And if you have questions about your ESG-CV grant, please reach out to your grant administrator. Again, if you have questions, you can continue to put those in the chat. Next slide, please. And now I would like to hand it over to Chris, Tyler, and David for today's presentation on HCD ESG-CV indirect costs.
Thanks, Marian, and thanks everybody for joining us this morning here in California. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the ESG-CV indirect costs, and I am lucky to have with me our partners from MDG, Tyler Bridges and David Munoz, to walk us through that. So without any further ado, I'll hand it over to that duo. Go ahead.
Thanks, Chris, and everybody. Good morning. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to talk about this hot topic that we've all been discussing for several months now, and we are on the tail end of this process. So again, I just want to thank you all for your patience and working with us and HCD, on getting these budgets and expenditures reconciled in eCivis. Next slide, please. So today we're going to talk about just an overview of the indirect cost reconciliation process. Then we're going to discuss how to complete updated RFF and budget revision forms. And I promise you they're just minor updates. Then how to complete budget amendments in eCivis, and then what the next steps are, and then some Q&A. Next slide. So first, let's just talk about the process in general. Next slide. So the purpose of this training is to walk through the next steps for reconciling indirect cost budgets and expenditures in eCivis. Next slide. So who does this apply to? This training applies to all ESG-CV grantees, especially those that will seek reimbursement of indirect costs in eCivis for their ESG-CV award. We know there's a handful of you, I don't know the number off the top of my head, that are not ultimately seeking reimbursement for indirect costs, but the new forms, you'll still be using the new forms moving forward. But we want particular attention paid by those that are seeking indirect costs. Next slide. So this is just a high-level timeline of events. This month, February, we're asking that you submit your updated budget revision form and also amend your eCivis budget to include indirect costs. And then in March is when you'll begin to submit the updated RFF form to include your indirect costs. So for the February RFF, just use the standard form. Make sure to work with your grant administrator to ensure that you're able to submit your RFF and get that approved, or whatever discussions you're having with your grant administrator with that regard prior to amending your budgets. So we know that there's a process, right, with respect to the timing of submitting RFFs and amending your budgets. Next slide. At the end of this presentation, sometime later today, your grant administrator will email the following resources: the updated RFF form, the updated budget revision form, a kind of cheat sheet, if you will, a 1, 2, 3, this is how we get this process completed. And then also some steps or a checklist with screenshots on how to amend your budget in eCivis to include the indirect costs. Next slide. All right, so first let's talk about the updated budget revision form. Next slide. The budget revision form has been updated to differentiate between budgets for direct and indirect costs. The updated budget revision form replaces the existing form and must be used by all ESG-CV grantees effective immediately, even those grantees that are not charging indirect costs. So, and I'll show you how simple it is to use and the minor changes for not only those grantees that are going to charge indirect costs, but also those that are not. Next slide. So who must use the new form? For ESG-CV grantees that are going to charge indirect costs, you'll need to use the form to update your budgets for direct costs and indirect costs by budget component. So that's, emergency shelter, HMIS, admin, et cetera. And you'll need to use this form for all pending and planned budget amendments. So if you have one that's in process or about to move forward, you'll want to use the new form to also get your indirect costs taken care of at that time. For ESG-CV grantees that will not charge indirect costs, you don't need to submit a budget revision form unless you do have a planned or pending budget amendment or any future budget amendments, you'll need to submit the new form. And when I say new, I mean updated budget form. Next slide. So this is the budget revision form. There are only two changes. The first change is right under the title block. You'll see two new spaces where you'll need to enter your indirect cost method and your indirect cost rate. The three methods available, and there's the little pop-up tooltips in here that you'll be able to hover over with instructions in the form itself, are cost allocation plan, negotiated indirect cost rate, or de minimis. So you'll just type in one of those three. If you're not charging indirect costs, just type in NA. And then for your rate, if you are using de minimis, type 10%. If you aren't charging indirect costs, type 0. And if you're using another method, then you'll go ahead and type your rate right there. So really, it's just typing in your rate and your method. That's it for that change. And then the next update on the next slide. So here, this has also been updated. Previously, it used to just have, it had your original budget, your current approved budget, and your new budget request. And it only had one column, which was just all direct and indirect costs lumped into one column. We've removed the original budget because we're beyond that now. I think almost everybody, if not everybody, has amended their budget at least once. Even if you haven't amended your original budget, your current approved budget is your original budget. So original budget is no longer on this budget revision form. It's now just your current approved budget and your new budget being requested. And in addition, there's now a column for direct costs and a separate column for indirect costs, and it's by budget category. So emergency shelter, street outreach, homeless prevention, etc. What you'll want to do is you'll want to enter your direct cost budget and your indirect cost budget by budget category. In your, you can fill that out for both your current approved budget and then your new budget. What's really important is getting the new budget right, of course. When it comes to your current approved budget, you may not have distinguished between direct and indirect costs on the prior budget revision form. However, you may have actually budgeted indirect costs in eCivis. And so you can go ahead and fill this out to your grant administrator's liking with respect to the current approved budget in terms of differentiating between direct and indirect costs. But what you really want to get right, and this is all the TA sessions we've all had with you and the one-on-ones, is making sure that you're entering your direct and indirect cost budgets separately in the new budget request form. Also, one more reminder on this, you're not entering your subrecipient's indirect costs onto this form. You're just entering your agency's indirect costs. So if you're a county and you're a direct recipient of funds from HCD, so your HCD's ESG-CV grantee, you're just entering your indirect cost budgets by category. I think almost all of you have elected to just charge all of your indirect costs to admin. And so if that's the decision you made, just put the indirect costs in under your admin budget category. Or if you're spreading them throughout your other budget categories, go ahead and do so as well. All right, next slide. So submitting the updated budget revision form. So again, just those two changes. What you'll need to do is just like we just went over, you're going to update the budget revision form to add the indirect cost budgets. If you are not, please also include, like I said, if you have pending or planned budget revisions that you would normally just need to submit a new budget revision form in order to complete that process, go ahead and use the new budget revision form. If you are not charging indirect costs whatsoever, then again, you'll just enter NA and 0 on the budget revision form and then leave the indirect cost column blank. So go ahead and update those budget revision forms, submit them to your grant administrator via email, and get their approval. And then once that's approved, then when you begin to, when you process your budget amendment, which is our next discussion, you'll upload the revised approved budget revision form into eCivis along with the amendment. Next slide. All right, so let's now talk about the eCivis budget amendment process. The following slides are going to walk through the process for amending eCivis budgets to remove existing indirect cost budgets if they are there, add new indirect cost budgets, and this will be in line with your budget revision form, edit existing direct cost budgets, and this may be necessary because you're also processing a budget, other budget revisions, or just because you need to if you're going to be adding a budget for indirect costs, you may need to be, reducing your direct cost budget in order to accommodate that new budget line item. And then finally, upload the approved updated budget revision form. So 1, 2, 3, 4. We're going to be including in the materials that your grant administrator sends out today or possibly tomorrow, a checklist with screenshots step by step on how to amend your eCivis budget. So the next few slides are a high-level summary of that process. Next slide, please. Again, who must amend these eCivis budgets? So if you're a grantee that will charge indirect costs, you'll need to complete this budget amendment process to update budgets for direct costs and indirect costs by budget component. And it just needs to match that budget revision form. And you also need to complete this process, obviously, if you have pending or planned budget amendments in the pipeline. So, the best course of action is to take care of this all at once instead of submitting, quick successive budget amendments. For ESG grantees that will not charge indirect costs, you may still need to complete this process if you have indirect cost budgets that must be removed in eCivis. So you may have previously set them up either deliberately or inadvertently, or for whatever reason, they may be in there, but you have since elected to not charge indirect costs. You'll still need to go in there and clean that up. And it's a quick process. And then in addition, if you have pending or planned budget amendments, you would just go through the same workflow as you would for amending a budget, but you don't have to do anything with respect to indirect costs. So I guess I should say this: when it comes to the updated budget revision form and amending your budgets in eCivis and submitting the updated RFF form, all of those processes are the same. Okay, so we're not changing the workflow whatsoever. We're just adding the new components to address indirect costs. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a screenshot of what would be the budget amendment process. And again, we'll provide a step-by-step, with screenshots checklist of how to complete this. But once you get into onto the screen and it's the first screen, award details, right underneath your budget, you have this thing that says budget settings. And it has two components: the indirect cost drop-down menu and then the match cost share drop-down menu. We're focusing specifically and solely on the indirect cost option at this time. So you'll be able to select one of 4 options, I think. There's negotiated rate, which includes cost allocation plans and indirect cost rate proposals, de minimis, itemized, or NA. And then there may or may not be a percentage next to that. Regardless of whatever option you have selected, you just need to change it to NA. It does, and what that will do is a warning message will pop up and it'll say, "Are you sure you want to do this?" Click yes, and it'll wipe clean all of your indirect cost budgets. We have reviewed all 40 of your indirect cost budgets in eCivis, and they all do need to be wiped. They're all substantially different from what we have all worked together on over these past 6-8 weeks. So there's nothing wrong with that. It's not going to mess anything up. You'll just want to wipe them clean so we can start fresh. And so luckily it's really easy to do. So again, once you get onto this page under budget settings, doesn't matter what it says, it doesn't matter what you've already entered beneath that, just change this drop-down menu to NA and then accept the warning message. Next slide, please. Okay. Beneath that budget setting is all of your budget items. We also call them budget categories. So emergency shelter, street outreach, homeless prevention, etc. What you'll need to do is click on each of these in order to correct both your direct and your indirect, and then add your indirect cost budget. So again, this is the normal process that you would go through amending your budget. But so once you have your budget revision form reviewed and approved via email by your grant administrator, you'll have a really clean table in that budget revision form that says by budget category, this is my budget for direct, this is my budget for indirect. So all you'll need to do is click on each of these hyperlinks and complete the little table beneath it on the following slide in just a moment. When you're done with that process, you'll come back and look at this screen here, and you'll see that there's the second column. It says EXT cost and then direct cost, right? Direct cost needs to match the column in the budget revision form for direct costs. And then right next to that is indirect costs, same thing. So whatever your budget revision form says, as approved by your grant administrator by budget category, at the end of the day, when you're completing this process, needs to match the same budget figures for direct and indirect costs on that budget revision form. So to edit these high-level budgets, you're just clicking on these hyperlinks here. And now we can go to the next slide, please. Once you click on the hyperlink, the screen will expand for that little section, and you're going to get a table that looks like this. You can add rows at the bottom left there in order to, you may have one row, for example, that just says direct costs. You may have a row in there that says indirect. I know I said previously that it'll wipe them all out. If you had already selected NA, you may have some lingering in there, but for most folks, indirect should not be gone, should not be there. Some ESG-CV grantees also entered multiple line items here for round 1 or round 2, or maybe for subrecipients. At the end of the day, here's what you need to complete here. Your direct cost budgets need to be accurate, and as you update this table, the direct cost and the indirect cost high-level budgets above it in this gray area here, those will update as you complete this table. At the end of the day, you should have just one line item for indirect costs, and it needs to be for the amount that you entered on your budget revision form. And then when it comes to your direct costs, ideally we're only requiring you to have one line item that also matches that the budget revision form. But if you have multiple line items for whatever reason and you don't want to change them, that's fine, so long as at the end of the day your high level direct cost and indirect cost budgets match your budget revision form. Okay, so in summary here, at minimum you just need 2 line items, one for direct, one for indirect, and they need to match the high level budgets in your budget revision form. And again, we'll provide a checklist to walk you through these steps. It's really easy, I promise. All right, next slide, please. Once you complete that process, you'll then upload your budget revision form, and that'll kind of memorialize and keep a record of the approval process, and then your grantee administrator or grant administrator can obviously reference it during their review process. So please upload that budget revision form here before finally submitting the amendment to your grant administrator for review and approval. Next slide, please. Okay, that's it. I hope it goes as easy as that for all of you. And I hope that the resources that we provide will be helpful in that regard. We'll also offer a TA here at the end. Next slide, please. Now we're going to talk about the RFF form. The RFF form has been updated to add a new section or new sections to report indirect costs. And again, I promise it's a minor change. It's not. It's minor. The updated RFF form replaces the existing form and must be used by all grantees effective March 1st. So for your March invoice, which would cover, February costs, the one that's due by March 10th, that is when we want to begin using the updated RFF form. Even grantees not charging indirect costs. So again, this is just replacing the old form. So everybody needs to use it beginning in March with the March RFF. Next slide, please. Okay, so when to use the new form. And for your February RFF, which is, I think, due in a couple days here, just use the existing form, and we'll tackle this in March. In March, if you are charging indirect costs, you're going to submit 2 RFFs in March, and it's going to be on the updated form. 1 RFF and 1 single financial report for indirect costs only will be submitted. And then you'll also submit what would otherwise be your regular direct cost financial report in RFF. So 2 financial reports, separate financial reports in eCivis with separate RFF forms. 1 for direct, 1 for indirect. If you're not charging indirect costs, just follow your regular process as you did in February, but using the new form. And then for April RFFs and moving forward, you will just use a single form, the updated RFF form, but at that time you'll begin to just combine your direct and indirect costs for all of your RFFs from April moving forward. So the reason we did this is for March, because we're reconciling our indirect costs, we want to have a separate RFF and a separate financial report to make that process, real clean and transparent. And so that we all understand, these are the indirect cost reconciliation charges we're billing at this time. And so that it doesn't get confused with your other direct costs that you had incurred for the month of February. But beginning in April, then you'll just use 1 form for all of your direct and indirect costs until we're done with the grant. Next slide. Okay, so here's what we updated. On the RFF workbook, there's the RFF, the cover sheet really, and then there's all the separate tabs for each of the 6 budget categories. At the very bottom of every budget category tab, there's just 1 new box, and it's called indirect costs. And this is where you'll always enter your indirect costs for your agency. We'll talk about where to charge your subrecipients indirect costs in just a moment. But right now, when you're going to charge your agency's indirect costs, you need to charge them by budget category. And again, if you're putting all of your indirect costs in admin, then you only need to fill out this box at the bottom of the budget or the admin budget category tab. So you don't need to itemize your indirect costs like you do for all the other direct costs. You just need to enter the lump sum amount of those indirect costs. And that's because nearly all of you are using de minimis, but even the few who aren't, indirect costs are a percentage of direct costs. And so you don't need to line item your indirect costs. They're just a percentage of the total amount of your direct costs. So again, the only change to the RFF form is there's a new box for indirect costs at the bottom of each tab for each budget category. And you only complete this box if you have elected to charge indirect costs and you, the ESG-CV grantee, not your subrecipients, have indirect costs to charge. You will enter it here. And then the rest of the math, adds up on the cover page. Even when you submit your financial report in eCivis, there's no column that says this is how much is direct and this is how much it's indirect. It's just that total amount. And it's going to be the total amount that appears on the cover page. Okay, so just this 1 new box at the bottom of the budget categories tabs. Next slide, please. Okay, and again, here's the what indirect costs should be reported for the ESG-CV grantee indirect costs. So you must be reported in the new indirect cost section at the bottom of each budget category. So just saying that again. When it comes to subrecipients indirect costs, so your own subrecipients, those must be reported in the existing sections by budget category and activity. And I'll elaborate that on the next slide here. Next slide, please. So again, this is that same screenshot. So you know that already in the RFF form for each of the budget category tabs, there's several line items and it's by activity. So the budget component is contained within each tab, but then you've got all these different line items that you can report your expenditures on. Those, when your subrecipient, and we've said this to all those that we met with, when your subrecipient charges their indirect costs and their direct costs to you, the ESG-CV grantee, those are all considered your direct costs. Again, at the bottom of each workbook, that's where you charge your indirect costs, those that your agency incurred. But when it comes to your direct costs and your subrecipient's direct and indirect costs, all of those need to be entered into the top, the ordinary boxes that already existed in the RFF form. And again, if you have any questions about this, hopefully we can maybe answer them today, but also we'll try and answer them via email or a TA session if necessary. Next slide. Okay, so we're at the end of this. Next steps. Next slide, please. So this is kind of high level how this will, take place. You're going to get the updated email with these forms and resources from your grant administrator. Go ahead, and this applies to everybody, just submit your regular RFF and eCivis for your direct costs by February 10th. Then after that process is complete, or simultaneously, but complete your updated budget revision form to outline your direct and indirect costs, submit that via email and get it approved. Then amend your eCivis budget, get all that done prior to, in the month of February, prior to when you would need to submit your March RFF. And you're going to submit two, one for indirect costs and then a separate for your direct costs. Next slide. Okay, questions. We'll now pause for questions. If you do need, after you receive the resources from your grant administrator and you have a chance to kind of digest them, if you do have questions, communicate with your grant administrator and they'll reach out to us if necessary. Or if you need to schedule time to kind of walk through the process, or if you have a particular question, also reach out to your grant administrator and they'll be able to reach myself and David and others in order to help you through this process. We definitely want to get this right so that we never have to go back to it. So we're here to help. Okay. And with that, we'll take questions.
Thank you, Tyler. We have questions just starting to come in, but I'm going to give a little bit more time for questions to continue to roll in. I think this was a great session on indirect costs and how they look in eCivis. Also an update to indirect costs and the request for funds form, RFF. It's a lot of information, so I understand that you guys might be a little overwhelmed trying to take it all in. Obviously, we are recording this and we will be posting it. You'll note in the chat, I dropped in our training on indirect costs, which I think maybe Tyler did, or it could have been Rudy Munoz, someone from MDG did that. So if you just need to know what indirect costs are, that's a really good training. But today, really, we talked through the how, really how to do this and how to do it well. So I'm going to go ahead and ask a quick question for you, Tyler, from Anissa. And remember, this is now part of the brown bag. So we are in Adobe Zoom meeting. So you can unmute yourself. You can talk. You can ask questions live to Tyler as well. But I'll start with this first one from Anissa. Can you clarify what you said regarding our subrecipients' indirect costs being our direct costs?
Yes, and I know that this is confusing for myself sometimes even. So thank you for asking that question. You have a single subrecipient agreement, let's say, with ABC subrecipient, and it's for $100,000, and they have for simplicity, I'm just going to say $90,000 in direct costs and $10,000 in indirect costs. It actually ends up being 92,000 and 8,000 or some, because indirect costs are a percentage of direct costs. If you have a $100,000 budget and you have $90,000 in direct costs, 10% of 90,000 is only $99,000. But you have a $100,000 budget. So I said I'm being simple in the sense that we're just going to call direct cost 90 and indirect cost 10, but in reality, it's like, I don't know, $91,000 and $9,100. Okay, so you have a subrecipient agreement with them, and they have $100,000, $90,000 for direct, $10,000 for indirect. You're calculating, and they're calculating their indirect costs for every $10 or every dollar they charge of direct costs, they're going to add 10% to that, right? So if they charge $1,000 in a given month of direct costs, they get to apply that 10% to it. Then they're, instead of charging $1,000, they're going to charge you $1,100. Okay. When that invoice comes into you, which is a combined direct and indirect, and you pay it, that is a direct cost for you, the ESG-CV grantee. There, you can then charge your 10% on top of that. It's actually 10% of the first 25,000. If you apply your indirect cost rate to that payment of $1,100 that you just made, that application of your rate is your indirect costs. It's not theirs, right? So I guess in summary, what I'm trying to say is it doesn't, whatever your subrecipients bill you, whether they're calling it direct or indirect, it's always a direct cost to you. The only time that you incur an indirect cost is if you apply your percentage to that cost from the subrecipient. I hope that answered your question.
Thanks, Tyler. I think it did. I think it helped me understand. Maybe not. I see a long question from Eleanor. I'm going to ask Eleanor, would you like to unmute and ask your question verbally? I can probably stumble through it, but it might not be as valuable.
Sure. As I'm understanding it, I just want to get a clear view of it. It sounds like so we're an ESG-CV grantee who we will not be charging indirect costs, but our subrecipients are charging indirect costs. With our new budget revision, it sounds like those that were in that we made a previous revision to include our subrecipients' indirect costs, thinking that that needed to be in there. So it sounds like we need to change the budget to show just direct costs, since we're not charging any indirect costs ourselves. Is that correct?
That's correct. If you, the ESG-CV grantee, is not charging your own indirect costs, then your budget revision reform will always have 0 in the indirect cost column. Your budget in eCivis will have 0 for indirect costs, and your RFF form at the bottom of every budget category page or the tabs will always be blank. That indirect cost bucket will be blank.
Okay, so there's
0, 0, 0 for you, the grantee, even if your subs are billing indirect costs to you.
Okay, and so there's a second part to this question. Initially, we were told to back out all indirect costs out of the RFF, and no distinction was made between grantee indirect costs and subrecipient indirect costs. So because of this, we submitted just our subrecipients' direct costs. Now we have all those subrecipient indirect costs that we backed out, and those are going to need to now be submitted. However, what verification can we use to prove those line items, since the base was included on RFFs from previous? How do we go about doing that? Does that make sense?
It makes complete sense. And it is an excellent question. And I'm glad you asked it, because everybody should hear this. So if you have indirect costs incurred by your subrecipients that have not yet been charged to the ESG-CV award, you'll want to submit that, even if you're not charging your own indirect costs, but you're just charging your subrecipients' indirect costs. You need to submit that separate RFF in March that's just for indirect costs. And in all of the direct cost categories in each tab where you bill your subs direct costs and your own, but just for the purposes of catching up on their indirect costs, you would charge all of their indirect costs by the budget, the different categories and the different budget line items within each of those tabs. So that they are now caught up and you are caught up on charging their indirect costs. When it comes to the use of indirect costs, especially the de minimis, if your subrecipients elect to use the de minimis, they are not required to submit supporting documentation. And so there's nothing for you to submit either. When it comes to, even if they had used the other methods, again, they don't have to submit supporting documentation showing I spent this money on rent or payroll or whatever. You'll just have to collect a copy of their cost allocation plan and their agreement with their cognizant agency. So when it comes to submitting supporting documentation for indirect costs on behalf of your subrecipients or your agency, along with your RFF, there is none.
Okay.
But that's why we wanted that separate indirect cost RFF, so your grant administrator knows this is us catching up on our subs indirect costs. And when you are monitored by HCD, you'll want to have in your records a clean analysis or spreadsheet at how you arrived at those costs.
Okay. So one of our, and you may have mentioned it, but I might have missed it. We do have two of our subrecipients that are charging the de minimis, but we do have one with the negotiated, and all of those are lumped together in because the way I've been keeping track of it is on a separate RFF form, pending clarification on indirect costs. So in that case, I know you said with 10% de minimis, there's no verification, but with the negotiated rate, we do have the verification of what was negotiated. So in that case, would that need to be submitted with the RFF?
No, you just have, no, you don't have to submit a copy of their negotiated agreement. You just need to have that available at the time of monitoring.
Okay, and then this one, it was not necessarily, this is another indirect cost question, and it was not necessarily posed, and it wasn't part of the material here today. We do have a subrecipient who is charging rent, and we were not looking at it as an indirect cost because they opened a separate facility to do ESG-CV funding only. That's all they do at that facility. Is that still, we considered it a direct cost because that's all they do at that facility. Is that a correct determination?
Rent can be a direct cost, and in the scenario that you described, as I understand it, yes, that is a direct cost. You just need to be careful that they're not getting a 10% plus up on top of that for indirect costs, because indirect costs are meant to cover things like rent. But if you're charging it as a direct cost, they can't get the 10% plus
they're
up.
They're not getting the 10%.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That was it.
Thanks, Eleanor. Thank you, Tyler, as well. Very helpful. I'm learning a lot myself today. Another question from Tamara. And Tamara, if you'd like to jump in, please do verbally, but I'll read this one. It's a short one. For monitoring purposes, will we need the subrecipient's indirect costs determination for our records?
Your 2 CFR 200, it's actually 200.331, says that your agreement, your subrecipient agreement between you, the grantee, and your subrecipients needs to state the method that they have selected for indirect costs and their rate. If you have that, then you've passed your monitoring check 1. Now, if they have selected de minimis and it's in their subrecipient agreement, like I just described, then no other supporting documentation is required. You call it done at de minimis. If their method is either cost allocation plan or indirect cost rate agreement proposal, NICRA, then you will need a copy of the actual proposal or plan, and then a copy of the signed agreement from, it's typically HHS, but their cognizant agency, saying, yes, we approve, this is their rate, this is their period, and they're only annual periods, and it's signed and dated. And you'll need to collect that form, that agreement every year for the period of performance of the subrecipient agreement you have with them. So if you have a 2-year agreement with them, then you may need to collect 2, maybe 3 because of overlapping fiscal years. You'll need to keep getting copies of that agreement. So those are the records you'll need to have on file. I'll just say it again, for de minimis, nothing else. If they have negotiated rates or cost allocation plans, you need a copy of the plan and every year's signed agreement from HHS.
Thanks, Tyler. Tamara, if you have any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat or unmute yourself. You can talk directly to us. Going to take a question from Carrie as well here, Tyler. So on their very first request for funds form, they submitted some ineligible indirect costs. For example, indirect on rapid rehousing rental assistance. Should we make those adjustments on our March indirect RFF? And you may not be able to answer that, and that's okay.
No, I can. So yes, if you have, when you are charging when you're reconciling your indirect costs for you and your subrecipients, you definitely need to consider what you've already charged to HCD and been reimbursed for. And then you should be only charging the difference between the two. Now, if in some instances you have charged HCD more indirect costs than you should have on behalf of a subrecipient after you've performed this analysis, then you need to work with your grantee administrator on how to adjust those costs through your direct cost invoices or otherwise. So I'm thinking that in most cases, even if you accidentally overcharged on indirect costs, that you should be able to cover those costs with just with direct or indirect costs that you haven't charged yet. But there may be instances where you perform this reconciliation, you find, oops, for subrecipient A, I requested too much from you, you being HCD. And in that case, you'll need to follow what would otherwise be the same process as you would if you overcharged HCD for anything.
Thanks, Tyler. Carrie, if you have any other questions, again, feel free to unmute yourself or put another question. I'm not seeing any further questions, Tyler. I think this was a very technical, very dense session, and I think folks are just needing time to absorb it. So I'll give it just a little bit, another minute or two, another second or two before I see any other questions, and if not, we'll just move forward. Note that next week's brown bag session is also our friends at MDG. Chris Andrews will be joining us, and we'll be talking about monitoring in particular. So not just monitoring for indirect costs, as Carrie's question, but just monitoring in general. I'm seeing no more additional questions. Tyler, anything else you'd like to say before we depart?
Again, I can't thank you all enough for attending and for participating and meeting with us and filling out our forms over the past few months. You've all been great. You really have. And this is the home stretch. You'll be receiving an email today or tomorrow from your grant administrator. I would say tomorrow, because we're still putting the final touches on one of them. With all of this video, the resources, the forms, all of it. You'll get that. And then if you have any questions, do not hesitate to reach out.
Thank you, Tyler. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. I want to thank David for being with us, also from MDG, our ESG-CV grant administrators, and our ESG annual team for being here. We'll be back at it next week. Again, the topic will be monitoring. Enjoy the rest of your day.